Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. In this episode of the Farmall Super C restoration, I'm going to continue work on the engine. And the goal for this episode is to get the rear main seal on, which is a pain on these engines, frankly. Get the oil pan on, get the oil pump in, get the front timing cover on, so we got kind of the ends and the bottom part of the engine closed up. These are the three pieces that make up the rear main seal, which goes around the crankshaft. The crankshaft fits right in here, and I've got felt soaking that go in these slots, and they make the seal. The real pain in the butt about these seals is, first of all, getting the felt in properly and getting it nicely tucked in there and getting the joint to seal on the sides here. And the other thing is that these are aluminum, so what happens is, maybe you can see that, but look at the deformation there. The bolts pull down on the aluminum and the aluminum deforms in between, so you never get a straight one of these. They're awful. See that gap? My gosh. In the past, what I've done to flatten these is put sandpaper on a piece of float glass and sand and sand and sand to get them as flat as you can. It takes a long time, and I did that on the MD, if you remember. I'm not doing it that way today. But before we get to the way I am going to do it, we got to set these felts in the channels here. This is just an exercise in patience getting these guys in right. You just tuck and tuck till everything is tucked. And you definitely don't want to trim the ends of these. These are sized to fit. You just need to get them into the channel pressed in so that everything fits right. And it's okay to have a little bit hanging out of here, because when you put the two halves together, they'll press in and make a tighter seal at the joint. And then the other half, this is actually the top half of the seal. You gotta keep these centered in here so that they extend the same amount on either side. Just tons of fun. Now the felts were soaked in oil, and oil of course ran all over the place. I'm going to clean these off with some lacquer thinner because I want a nice clean gasket surface, including these mating edges. With these main seals, the devil is in the details. It is. So many of them leak after they're installed new. You got to pay attention. Now, given all the deformation I have along the gasket surface, I'm not going to use the gasket that came with the kit. I'm going to use Permatex Right Stuff, which works awesome to fill in any irregularities you have. In my mind, much easier than sanding and much more trouble-free than a paper gasket. It's not old school, but it works. I debated taking the engine off of the stand to do this work, but I'm gonna fuss it into place here. Did I mention that these are a pain? I think I did. I can't see a thing. I'm not going to tighten these down all the way. I just want to get them most of the way down. Then we're going to put the lower half together. Before I put the top half, or the bottom half, I guess, of the seal together, I'm going to show you this groove in the crankshaft. And as the crankshaft spins, this groove will catch any oil that's making its way through that felt seal and bring it back into the engine. Whenever you have a felt seal, you'll see a groove in the end of the crankshaft like that to catch oil. I'm going to put gasket sealer on the other half, and this bottom surface here actually goes into this piece that's at the edge of the oil pan, so I'm not going to put sealer on that yet. We'll put it on the other piece when we put it on. And on this side we got this mating surface where the two halves come together. I know I'm being generous with this stuff, but I want a seal. Better too much than too little in this case. And this side's going to go right on to here. And these bolts are going to be a pain again. Everything's got to smush together. And then under here, we've got the two bolts that hold the two halves tight together. And you want to get these bolts tightened up before you tighten down the two halves. I left these bolts loose. Of course, that's easier said than done. Smoosh together. Get the other side. There we go. Smushing together. I see lots of nice ooze out. That's what I want. Now with the two halves squeezed together, I can go ahead and tighten down the rest of the bolts. We got nice ooze out all along this, which is what I want to see. Tight seal. Next we've got this piece that goes down here and hooks onto the back of the seal here. These are felts that push in here that came with the gasket kit. I'm not a real big fan of this method, but it is what it is. So for this piece, we want to coat this side, seal this side, because this is where it engages with the rear main seal. And then we want to come around here to where it seats into the engine block. And then down in here we want to make sure we get these little areas where the piece seats in. Then we can set this thing in, hold it back from the rear main seal until we get it set down in here. I need a screwdriver. Tuck the felts in, get them started. You gotta go down in there with the gasket. You're a pain. Luckily the Permatex will make the seal behind you. And now we can use these bolts to draw it into the rear main seal. You're supposed to go in the hole, you know. You are. That's your job. It may look like a mess, but I think this is a better seal than the paper gaskets because it oozes into all the nooks and crannies that you've got running around and the way this fits together. And now then lastly, we've got two bolts here which will wind up being oil pan bolts to hold the oil pan on, which go through and secure this down. We just want to tighten them down a little bit so the seal sets correctly, and we'll take them out when we put the oil pan on. The next thing I want to take care of is the oil pump. And the oil pump has this gear here that's driven off of the camshaft, and all that does is spin a gear down in here that spins against another gear, and oil is pushed around the outside and builds oil pressure, and then it gets sent back up this tube into the main oil gallery. That's this slot here. The oil gushes back up in here. I shouldn't have dropped that. Now, these oil pumps are notorious for having problems. This applies to the A's, the B's, the C's, the Super A's, the Super C's, all the evolutions of this engine up through the 504. This cover warps. It's just aluminum, pot metal, I'm not sure which. And what happens is when you bolt it down here, it warps from true flat and it winds up blowing out someplace, and then that'll look like you've got poor bearings in your engine. The oil pressure will drop when the oil pressure warms up. The fix to this is to sand these flat, and I've already done this one once about 10 years ago, but I'm going to dress it up here because it's got a little bit of wear in it. This piece of float glass, and by its nature float glass is perfectly flat because the way it's made is they have a bed of molten metal. They pour the glass on top of that, and because of gravity and molten metal you wind up with a perfectly flat piece of glass. And I'm just using regular old sandpaper here. I know people will say, oh, you need to use a certain type of sandpaper. This is a soft metal, so I haven't found that it matters all that much. And you just want to drag it over in a random pattern here. I'm starting with a coarse 60 grit, and we can see where the bright spots are. It is deformed a little bit. Boy, these little buggers, it always happens to them. I've about got this to where I want it with the 60 grit. One thing you want to make sure of this, where the relief valve spring sets in here, you want to make sure you don't over sand that. It kind of hangs out and there's less surface on it, so, but you want to just check as you're going for flatness. Now it's time to change to a 120, or actually we'll go with 100. That's the next step up. Figure eights work good too. Here's what it looks like after 100 grit. Now we'll move on to 150, and this will be where I stop. I don't want it to be mirror smooth because I want something for the gasket to grab onto on the edges. And here's what we wind up with after 150. You get enough surface texture on here to grab the gasket that goes around the outside. You got to check it for flat. And be careful sanding these things. We're nice and flat. And we've taken all this to bright surface. There's a little bit of divot here and here, but we've got bright on the outside. That gasket will grab just fine around here. Now we can look at the main body of the oil pump, and of course we want to check this for flatness, but it's always flat. There's a lot of steel in here. Yeah, that's fine. Then we can put the driven gear in. And the first thing to measure for to check the pump is the clearance between the end of these gear teeth and the case, because it's forcing oil around through here. This is how it builds pressure. Not through here. And the spec on that is 5 thousandths to 8 thousandths is what you want for the clearance. So my 5 thousandths feeler gauge slips through. And here's my 8 thousandths. It does not. It's just for kicks. Let's see what the clearance is. So our clearance is someplace between 6 and 7 thousandths, which is good. Now the next thing to check is the end play of these gears, because you don't want oil bypassing and kind of escaping past the top of the gear. So end play is extremely important, and the spec on that is 3.5 thousandths to 6 thousandths. So let's just check it without the gasket here. 2 is the thinnest one I got. The 2 will just pass. Here I have gaskets for my gasket set, and the reason they give you more than one is so that you can get the pump to the proper distance, the pump cover to have the proper end play on the gears. So let's go ahead and put this on here, and then we can measure end play with the gasket, because the gasket is really important on an oil pump as far as increasing the end play. And remember, we wanted 3.5 to 6. So the 3 passes. Let's jump all the way up to the 6, because that's our kind of no-go. Six does not quite pass. And once I crunch down on this gasket a little bit, and you've got gasket sealer too, we ought to be about where we need to be with this gasket. So before I put this together permanently, I'm going to put it on dry, because we want to check how the pump turns. Dry, make sure everything is not binding. Cover's all on. I tighten down the bolts. You don't want to tighten these down too much, or you're going to deform the cover again. We'll just check to make sure it spins all right. It does. We'll pull this driven gear out here, and to help these pumps prime, I give them a liberal dose of assembly grease. Help them get a seal and start sucking oil. Clean the gasket surfaces off with lacquer thinner. We want a good seal on this for sure, and on the cover. Now this is the oil relief valve if it builds too much pressure. And this goes down here, it's a spring, and when it compresses, it'll dump oil back in instead of pumping it up into the engine when it gets to maximum pressure. So that goes right in there. Actually, you know what? I should lube that. So that goes right in there. Oh, I'm going to have to clean again. Put this paper thin gasket on. And then the spring goes back in. And the lid goes on. You got to work this down because you got spring tension you're working against. Work the bolts down on this evenly. Don't tighten them down too much or you're going to make it blow out again. Deform things. Hear that sound? I like that sound. It's the sound of the pump drawing air. It'll draw oil. Now we can install this oil pump. It just slides in through sleeve and the engine block. And then you got to get the gears to mesh. Takes a little turning to do so. There we go. Here's something I always do. This is the oil pickup for the oil pump, and this plate isn't meant to come off. It's got tabs on the back side of it, but I always take them off and look what I find. This is after it went through the parts washer. So much junk in there. That's why we do it. I'll wash it again. There we go, all cleaned up. Put it back together. Snap on there, buddy. All set. You can put this back on. It's a floating pickup, which means it floats near the top of the oil, and it's got clips here that restrain it in either direction, and then it's got a cotter pin which holds it in place. I guess when putting together an engine, you never want to hear somebody say, "Where's that cotter pin that I had?" Nope. What's for lunch? Oh, not baked pulley again. I'm tired of baked pulley. Next we can put on this front piece that kind of makes the intersection between the timing cover and the oil pan. And it's the same deal as the back piece. In fact, it's the same part number, same casting. Usually there's a bunch of gaskets that go in here, but you know how that goes. Not good luck with them. And these, once again, are temporary bolts packed with washers until the oil pan goes on, so that the seals will set. We're getting ready to put the timing cover on here, and I need to turn this, let's turn it the other way, this camshaft pulley around to align timing marks. We got 2 dots coming up right there. And this is a distributor and governor drive gear here. Lube it up. And this has timing marks on it too. There's a double dot right there. So we got to align these two. And if you put the cover, you can put this on through the front cover, but I'll tell you what, it's impossible to see these timing marks, so I put it in before the front cover. Here's the timing cover all cleaned up, and I need to set a new seal here in the crankshaft pulley hole. And it's a backwards sucker. I got my good old throwout bearing here. You get at least part way in. I'm going to pack this seal with grease because the pulley's going in hot, and it'll provide a little thermal buffer to protect the rubber. That's the theory anyway. And of course we want to lube the lip of the seal too. Always, always. When I was pulling this apart, I mentioned I'm not a big fan of these sheet metal front timing seals, because just like that rear main seal that I was talking about, this all is deformed here where the bolts have pulled down and bent the metal, and it's really hard to get a good seal on these. In addition, this is a gasket that came off, which has a fair thickness to it to take up some of that irregularity. Here's the gasket that I got in my gasket kit. It is probably half the thickness. I'm not trusting this gasket to hold a seal on this. So I'm back to using Permatex Right Stuff for this. Gaskets are important where there's a gasket thickness required for the parts to fit together. In this case, all I've got is the governor distributor drive that relies on that thickness. And that's easily adjustable if it needs to be adjusted at all because of this. It feels like somehow cheating in mechanics when you make a gasket like this, but the seal is so much better than you would get with a paper gasket. What are those cows complaining about? We can go ahead and fit this on. Now this is staying on loose for the time being so that this seal in here will align to the pulley when I put it in. It'll center itself. And here comes my pulley baked at 250 degrees for an hour. Well, that didn't go on very far. And now we can pull it on with a 1/2 inch bolt in the crankshaft pulley. And there we go, we're on all the way. That's always a fun job. You never know how it's going to go until you're in the middle of it. Now we can go ahead and put the rest of the bolts on, tighten them up. These get a flat washer in addition to a lock washer to help spread the load on this sheet metal here. Helps a little bit, I guess. Well, I'm glad that pulley's on. It's always a stressful thing. These bolts down here around the governor just go in temporary until I get the governor ready and put it on. Then they'll come out. This pulley did not go on the way that I wanted to. So the deal is you lube up the end of the crankshaft that it's going onto with some oil. You heat up the pulley. I heated it up to 250. And it should slide on at least part way. And then you have a 1/2 inch bolt ready to put into the threaded hole here with some washers or a socket or something on it, and you can pull it down with an impact wrench. Well, it didn't slide on the shaft as far as I thought that it would when it was hot, so the bolt that I had on hand was not long enough, so I wound up having to put a piece of brass on the end of it and pound on it with a sledgehammer, which isn't the best thing for the rear thrust bearing on the crankshaft. It'll be fine. It's just not the optimal way to do it. If you do it, have a set of different length bolts, or even better yet, a piece of all thread that you can thread in there with a nut on it to turn down the crank pulley. People also make jigs that go across the front and bolt into the holes here, but that puts stress on the thrust bearing still, so the ideal is a piece of all thread. I just didn't have one laying around and thought it would go together easier than it did. I'll tell you what, we are moving right along here. Remember, the 4 long bolts go 2 in this front corner here to hold down that bridge that goes across there, and then 2 go in the back where the rear main seal piece is. 4 long bolts, the rest of them are all the same length. This is a cork gasket under here, so the deal is, you kind of tighten them all down equally, and you don't want to tighten them too much with a cork gasket or you'll squeeze the cork out. So it's a feel thing, kind of. I usually go around a couple times and get them all about the same. She's starting to look like an engine. We'll turn it over and see how she looks. This project is moving right along. What's the next step? The next step is to take the engine off of the engine stand. I've got the flywheel, which Mr. Richards turned for me. I've got a new clutch to put on it, and then we'll mate the engine up with the rear half of the tractor. I like to have the engine on the tractor before I put the cylinder head on. It just gives me a nice stable piece to work with. It's just my personal preference. You can do it either way. And then I got to take a look at the governor, see what it needs. I haven't pulled it apart yet. Of course, we got to reassemble the valve train, the rocker arms, push rods, the valve cover, and then we'll have it all enclosed, so then we can paint it all at once. The reason I like to paint this all at once is because, number one, whenever you put your wrench on a bolt and turn a bolt in, you always knock some paint off the corners of the bolts. So if you get all those main bolts set first, you don't have to go back and touch them up. It just looks like a much cleaner job. The second reason is because you don't have to mask off all this stuff that doesn't need to be painted if you assemble it first. And the third reason is you just get a much better finish job with, as far as, it being one paint surface going over the joints. The joints become much less pronounced if you're painting the assembly all at once. So that's my reasoning. I hope you're enjoying this series. It's moving right along. I don't think I'm going to be done before Christmas, though. Don't get any ideas about that. I got a whole lot of parts that I got to clean up, and it's slow work, you know, hanging parts, painting them individually, adding them on. I'm going to be at this for a while. I'll see you next time. I'll see you next time. I think it's time to go in.